All right, in this lecture, let's get to talking about the new leadership in the US and the USSR. Now, I think I mentioned the election of Eisenhower, but he wasn't the only new leader on the world stage in 1953. Joseph Stalin died in March of 1953, and if you want to know more about that, I highly recommend watching the movie The Death of Stalin. It's not really the most historically accurate, but yeah, it kind of gets you this general story. Don't watch it for the historical accuracy, watch it for the humor. Nikita Khrushchev took over after Stalin, and this is the first semi-successful transfer of power in the Soviet Union when you consider all of Stalin's shenanigans with Trotsky. Well, let's talk about these new leaders in the Cold War. Eisenhower continued the policy of containment, but focused mostly on two things. One, military technology, and two, pushing communists back to pre-1945 areas. With what he called the New Look, Eisenhower directed a huge increase in building up the defense establishment. In the Eisenhower years, the United States spent 10% of its gross domestic product on defense spending. Today, it's about 3% or so. The U.S. nuclear arsenal soared from a few hundred to over 20,000 warheads that could be delivered on bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and even undersea via missiles. In 1952, the United States developed thermonuclear weapons. Maybe you've heard them called H-bombs or hydrogen bombs. And these super bombs were even more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some estimates say they could be up to 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic weapons of 1945. In just 7 years, that's a huge jump in destructiveness. Now, these weapons allowed for what Secretary of State John Foster Dulles called massive retaliation. And if the name Dulles sounds familiar, yes, the airport is named for him. John Foster Dulles was quite a character and involved in a lot of coups in Latin America, the overthrow of the Shah in Iran, but I think we'll get a chance to talk about that in a later lecture. We'll see. Anyway, the concept of massive retaliation was kind of descended from NSC 68's call for military buildup. If the United States showed strength by having a huge arsenal, they were essentially showing the Soviet Union that they didn't want to mess with the US. You've heard the expression, don't mess with the bull or you'll get the horns? It's kind of like that, except with thermonuclear weapons that number in the thousands. On the Soviet side, Nikita Khrushchev was a very different man than Stalin. For one, Khrushchev more or less ended the purges and began a program of de-Stalinization. He didn't call it that, but that's essentially what it was. This process ended the Gulag system, forced labor camps for critics of the state. In 1956, Khrushchev gave what's been called the silent speech before the Soviet version of Congress, where he argued that the cult of personality around Stalin was dangerous and needed to be ended so that the Soviet system could evolve and grow. After that, de-Stalinization included renaming things that were named after Stalin. So, for instance, the city of Stalingrad became Volgograd, for example. Stalin originally was put in Lenin's tomb, but his body was moved to the Kremlin Wall, which is a wall that surrounds the Kremlin and has stood since the 12th century. Oh yeah, and statues were taken down as well. By the way, little by the by, Lenin's tomb, creepy or creepiest? Khrushchev also oversaw the creation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And the Warsaw Pact was the communist answer to NATO. It included the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Essentially, the Warsaw Pact was a military alliance that created and maintained the buffer zone around the Soviet Union and demonstrated the USSR's commitment to having a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And for a few years, it seemed that the Cold War was beginning to thaw out a little bit. Eisenhower used diplomacy first when the Soviets started putting even more pressure on Berlin and invited Khrushchev to the United States to meet and discuss things to try to avoid a war. But the Cold War still overshadowed things, and the Soviet Union was keen to exploit the problems of the United States to use as propaganda against capitalism and democracy. Now, as you're probably aware, segregation was the law and custom of the land in the United States, north, south, east, and west. In the West, for instance, Latino children could not attend white schools. Asian students were often restricted as well. African Americans everywhere were restricted from buying homes in certain neighborhoods, i.e. most of them, considering the post-war boom in suburban housing typified by the cookie-cutter houses of Levittown. Levittown, all of them, refused to sell to black families. The guy who started Levittown said, I can solve a housing problem or I can solve a race problem. I can't solve them both. Talk about shirking responsibility. In the Deep South, every aspect of life from birth to death was segregated. Separate hospitals, schools, churches, water fountains, waiting rooms in the train station, public transportation, beaches, pools, amusement parks, jobs, stores, opportunities for bank loans, financial systems. Even cemeteries were segregated. Birth to death. During World War II, African Americans participated in what was called the Double V campaign: victory over fascism abroad and victory over Jim Crow discrimination at home. That led to some success. For instance, President Truman ordered the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. Black veterans helped lead the organizations that would start to dismantle Jim Crow segregation, with landmark court cases like Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. However, white Southern resistance to school desegregation sometimes meant the enforcement of that court order was lacking. The biggest moment of school desegregation came at the biggest high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, as the governor ordered the National Guard to Central High School to prevent 9 black students from entering and getting an equal education. President Eisenhower faced a constitutional crisis. Eisenhower privately criticized the Brown decision, but knew that it was his job as president to enforce it, and enforce it he did. On September 25, 1957, paratroopers from the Army's famed 101st Airborne Division, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, these are the guys who parachuted in on D-Day. They escorted the Little Rock Nine up the steps of Central High and into history. Melba Patillo Beals, a sophomore that year, recalled that for the first time she felt like an American citizen. She wrote about her experiences in a book. It's not too long, it's incredibly engaging, called Warriors Don't Cry. Anyway, the Soviet Union exploited this story and many others to show how the United States was all talk when it came to opportunity and equality. Despite this, some within the federal government believed that civil rights was full of communists. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who the FBI building is named for downtown, wiretapped Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Bayard Rustin, and many other civil rights leaders' phones, believing they were communists and communist sympathizers. Bayard Rustin, who was gay, faced even more scrutiny because of that. In the United States, homosexuality was against the law. Overall, during the Eisenhower administration, civil rights got a bit of a bump, though, because of the Cold War. The administration was aware of the propaganda power of civil rights and tried to lessen hostilities to the civil rights movement. Despite this, however, the Cold War managed to heat up in 1957. The story of the Little Rock Nine was still front-page news until October of 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into space. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, created a crisis in the U.S. scientific community and in the State Department. If the Soviets could launch something into space with a rocket, they could launch a nuclear weapon anywhere they wanted. The United States suddenly found itself far behind Soviet technology, and really behind when the next month they launched a dog into space, Laika. And I'm sorry to have to tell you this, she didn't make it. Sorry. There were other space dogs, though. Also, the Soviets launched another artificial satellite, Sputnik 2. This became the basis for the space race. Following Sputnik, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, with the purpose of catching up to the Soviets and going beyond. When President Kennedy took office, he pledged to put a man on the moon within the decade. I think I'll put a link to that speech. It's kind of short, it's really inspirational. 2019 was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and as you may be aware, the Air and Space Museum had this really cool commemoration on the National Mall where they projected the Saturn V rocket onto the Washington Monument at life size, and they did this short film presentation about everything it took to go to the moon. I'm not gonna lie, I cried. It was that inspirational. Wow, the moon! Ugh, so cool. But first, the US started experimenting to be able to put people into space. And of course, what did they use before sacrificing people? Chimps. Pictured in this slide is Ham, who was the first chimp to be put into space and safely return. It's so easy a chimp can do it, right? Here's not how easy it was. NASA didn't name him until after he got back because they didn't want people getting attached. Ham lived quite a while, though, after his adventure into space. So while that was successful, the Soviets, though, were ready to launch an actual cosmonaut into space. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in April 1961. The US followed shortly behind when Alan Shepard became the first American in space a few months later. The Soviet Union put not only the first man in space, but the first woman as well, when Valentina Tereshkova went into space in 1963. The US would not put a woman into space until my lifetime, June of 1983, when Sally Ride went into space in the Space Shuttle Challenger. Thankfully, that Challenger mission was successful. All right, we could go on and on about how cool space is and the space race is, but I think this is a good time to end our discussion about the early Cold War. We'll pick it up again as we kind of close things out for the semester.